What's up, everybody? We're back, and we are back with the third installment of the Sean McDowell and Voddie Baucham critical race theory and its compatibility with Christianity interview. And man, we actually haven't gotten to critical race theory yet. Perhaps we're about to get there in just a minute, but we have spent some time in the first two sections of this particular interview talking about Voddie Baucham and his sort of background and upbringing, which is very interesting. He gives his sort of a summary of his testimonial story and his experiences as a Black person, both from his youth and all the way to his time that he spent in Africa, and some of the experiences that he had there that sort of began to shape how he looked at the race issues in America. And so we are going to continue on from here. He just finished talking about slavery and how slavery, when we think about slavery and even reparations, we should think about them or not that we should, but he doesn't hear it often, that we would think about the slave sellers who are in Africa and why we don't demonize them as much as we demonize the Westerners who came and bought those slaves. And so you can go back and listen to that and see what you want. Right before we go any further, make sure you like and subscribe to join the community. I hope you guys have been doing that. I hope you're enjoying this. Again, the desire is to create a community. It's to create a community where we can think well, can discuss, can be authentic, and can even disagree respectfully. I think that growth happens when we're challenged. And I'm looking forward to being able to have a community that challenges each other and grows together in our ideas. And so if that's something that you're looking for too, then you want to make sure that you like and subscribe. I think you will have a ton to learn from other people as we challenge each other with ideas, as we move each other forward. I think that's what Romans 14 is about. You can go check out Romans 14. All right, let's finish. I keep saying finish. Let's continue this particular interview.
That's almost a mic drop moment that we could spend a lot of time unpacking, because that's a powerful truth. I appreciate you bringing that in. Voddie.
Okay, the mic drop moment was Voddie Baucham saying that he doesn't believe in reparations, but that if he did, he would be pursuing basically, not if he did, but people who he doesn't hear anyone asking for reparations from the Africans that sold us. He only hears us asking for reparations from the people who bought us.
One of the things I've heard from many of my Black friends and pastors is that when we talk about critical race theory, it's a side issue, it's a distraction.
Okay, we're getting
to the heart of real social justice. So, for example, we had an event at Biola within the past year. Some students put it on. They invited me and a young Black apologist to talk about critical race theory, and we had a wonderful discussion. And one of the things he says, I only really get invited here to talk about CRT. I wish you folks had invited me to talk about justice and what we could actually do to fix certain kinds of injustices that are taking place. I've heard that time and time again, which is enough for me to pause and say, am I missing something? How do I listen better? How do you balance that? You're writing a book because you are concerned about a certain view of social justice. Yet I know you would also affirm that we need to do the real work, so to speak. And I'm not implying your book's that's not the implication, but we've got to get out and fight against injustice. How do we balance the two of those together?
Yeah, and I think the way we balance that is by first rightly defining injustice. Okay. That's where we're missing each other, right? Because within the context of CRT, within the context of the social justice movement, social justice is redistributive justice. Social justice is about equity in outcomes and redistributing resources so that those resources are equitable among groups of people, right?
Okay, wrong. He says right at the end of that, I say wrong. Now he's going to say, how can I say wrong? Because he's going to pull up a bunch of academic paperwork that says this is what social justice is as it's defined. And he's using redistributive and resources as ways to determine justice. Voddie Baucham has done this time and time again, and this is my number one. If there's an issue I have with him, this is my number one issue with him, and it is this definition of social justice. It's an academic definition, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination what most people mean when they say social justice. When someone comes and says, I want social justice, they're not talking about redistribution of resources. They're talking about equitable experiences and opportunities. What they're saying is, I don't want to be treated differently because I am a particular shade of skin, or I have a particular shade of skin. And I don't want you to respond to the wrongs done to me differently based on my shade of skin or the perpetrator's shade of skin. These are experiences that people are talking about. Social justice is not about resources. It's about experiences. Now, resources are affected by the experiences. But when a police officer shoots a black person, and let's say for this hypothetical that he shoots a black person because he's racist, right? And he shot him. When the mother comes out and says, hey, I want justice for my son, she's not asking somebody to go to the resource house and redistribute some resources. What resources can be redistributed to give her justice for her son? No, that's not what they're asking for. What they're asking for is acknowledgement of the rights and the experiences and the opportunities that their son should have had. And they're asking the state to acknowledge that right was, and that opportunity and that experience was unjust, and to do whatever is necessary to make it right. Particularly, that's going to mean taking whoever did the unjust action and imposing the proper penalty for that unjust action. That has nothing to do with redistribution. That has nothing to do with resources. When a black person fills out an application for a mortgage and that mortgage is declined because for racial reasons, again, in this hypothetical, let's just say that it's true, that that's what happens. And it gets proven. Well, the person who's yelling for justice, they're not asking for resources to be redistributed. What resources need to be redistributed? What happened was, what was unjust was the experience and the opportunity was robbed and taken. And when you're asking for justice, you're asking for that experience and that opportunity to be rectified or to be dealt with or to be acknowledged and restituted or repaired, right? Or at least to change and further to change the future potentiality of that unjust action to continue to happen. That is what social justice is about. Social justice, it's about opportunities and experiences and rights. It's not about redistribution and resources. When you make it about redistribution and resources, you tie it to economy. And when you tie it to economy, then you tie it to socialism. And then you tie that to Marxism. And that's how you end up from social justice to Marxism. But that's not at all what people are talking about, which is why that's why people are just flat out missing each other. What he's talking about and how he's defining social justice is not at all how people are talking about it. It just isn't. Let's keep going.
And so that's the first thing. We need to understand that that's what social justice means.
No, it doesn't.
The second thing is, because of that, and when you look at CRT, for example, injustice is defined as inequitable or disparate outcomes. There is nothing wrong with disparate outcomes. Nothing. You and I, we're not the same size. We don't have the same strength. We don't have the same levels of intelligence. There's inequity between you and me. And God designed us that way, right? We're not all the same. We don't all have the same interests and the same abilities. And that's part of the beauty in the body of Christ, for example. right? I mean, the hand, just shouldn't say to the foot, I
Sure.
you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And so what social justice says is that there is an injustice when we're not all hands or when we're not all feet. And that's just grossly unbiblical.
Okay. First of all, it's not unbiblical. Now, you could say it's wrong, but it's not unbiblical. There's nothing about the Bible that talks about disparate or equitable outcomes. There's nothing biblical about that. So I don't know where he's getting this biblical concept. You can just say you disagree. Now, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what he's talking about here. I agree 100%. Disparate outcomes are not a problem. They're neutral. God created design. Excuse me. He created diversity and multiple versions and multiple diverse creations, right? Birds don't look like frogs, and anyway, yes, everybody is not the same. However, and it's also true that a society does not, just because a society has within it some inequities, that society is unjust or unjust. So those two things I agree with. However, here's where the challenge is, Voddie, and listen to me carefully here. Disparate outcomes do not equal injustice. So disparate outcomes are not always the product of injustice. So you write that down, but also write down injustice always creates disparate outcomes, right? So they're not two-way causal. They're not causal in two ways. Disparities do not always indicate the presence of injustice. There's scenarios where disparities are the product of justice or the product of way things should be. But when things are not the way they should be, it always produces inequities. You understand? Okay, so what does that mean for us as we try to break down what we're looking at? It means that whenever we see a trend of inequities in a scenario, it could be a random trend, but if it's a trend and we are looking at it over an extended period of time and across an extended breadth of circumstances, and we see a trend of inequities, what it should say is, hey, that's smoke. And where there's smoke, sometimes there's fire. Those who are arguing that the American society has inequities in it, has injustice in it, have to show the inequities that those injustices produce to even get the conversation looked into. Because if you have injustice, you're going to have inequities, right? That part of the conversation is causal. Injustices equal inequities. So if you have the presence of some inequities, it's at least worth looking into that maybe there's some injustice there, especially if there's a trend and a trend in one area, a trend across many areas. That would tell you that, that sure is a lot of smoke, right? Now, you may look into it and you may find, well, this particular one, the mortgage situation, that turns out to not be race injustice at all. Okay, cool. So you take that one out or but the inequities that are being talked about so that they can be looked into. And this is the part of what critical race theory does. What critical race theory does, it says, hey, let's look at the outcomes, meaning the outcome of a law, and see if the outcome achieves what we intended it to do. We wrote Brown versus Board of Education as an example. Brown versus Board of Education was designed not to desegregate schools. That was desegregation was the means. The end was that black children and white children receive the same base level of education. That was the end, right? What is the result? What is the desired result of Brown versus Board of Education? It's not desegregation of schools. The desired end game of Brown versus Board of Education is that black children and white children, that black children are educated with the same quality as the white children were. That's the end. Okay, so you passed the law, Brown versus Board of Education, and that led to desegregation because you thought by desegregating, you would be able to get that mutual educational experience. Critical race theory comes and says, okay, let's look at the outcome of that particular law and see if black children actually education did in fact go up, or did the system evolve and that law is no longer good. That outcome, that measured outcome, is to say, did it work? Did it work? Did it achieve what it's supposed to do? If it didn't achieve what it's supposed to do, then let's look at the law to make sure that the law is neither the cause nor the hindrance of the intended outcome. So when you bring inequities into the scenario, right? And you say, okay, we've got a wage gap, or we've got this, or this outcome, or this outcome, that outcome. Well, there were some laws that were passed that were supposed to help make sure these things didn't happen for racial reasons. But we do see those outcomes. So let's go back, be critical about the laws that we made, and make sure that there's nothing in those laws that are unjust and therefore creating this inequity. That's the basis of what critical race theory began with. This analysis of the law and the outcome to see whether the law needed to be changed or if it was good as it was. That's the basis. So the outcome conversation is a part of evaluation, just like it is in everything that we do, right? You evaluate something based on its outcome, and you go back and you reevaluate, you analyze. And the only way to do that for a nation is to watch trends. And you're looking for smoke to make sure that there's no fire. That's what inequities are. There's smoke that may be from a fire. And some people have taken a course to say, man, where there's smoke, there's absolutely fire. I would soften that. I would say that inequities are a red flag. They're a warning sign that says, hey, something could be going on here. And when they're there for a sustained period of time, we should look into them.
The other problem is that we do deal with injustice, even if you want to say in terms of disparities, right? But what social justice says is you always look at disparities in terms of the oppressor-oppressed dynamic. And you look at it in terms of the injustice of the oppressor creating an environment where the oppressed end up getting these disparate outcomes, as opposed to saying we need to look at all of these factors. These are complex issues, and we need to look at them that way and determine what types of things lead to these disparities. So when we start talking about, incarceration rates and graduation rates and, crime rates and all these sorts of things, we have to look at this sort of, multivariate analysis of why it is that these things exist, instead of just saying they exist, therefore injustice.
Okay, I don't disagree with that. Yes, I think, again, that's what I'm saying. On some level, I'm saying that race is one of the variables that we should look into when disparities show up. When disparities show up in an alarming fashion. And I would agree that one should not, based on a disparate outcome, conclude that the only cause of that outcome is some sort of singular injustice. And he said it's complex, and it's potentially true that for most disparities there is a confluence of variables. But the law has but the responsibility of a government and the law is to make sure that there's nothing in the law that is exploited as unjust, or racially motivated. And that criticism of the law is what critical race theory is dealing with, particularly, very specifically. It's illegal. It's not trying to solve all things race. It's trying to solve racism in the legal system and in the governing policies, primarily.
That makes sense. I can tell because you cite him in the book, because you're pulling a lot from the work of Thomas Sowell, who I recently found out. I didn't even know he had a YouTube channel. Subscribe to that. I've read 3 or 4 of his books. And especially when he talks about disparity and discrimination, his point is that disparities, in your example with you and me, whether it's height or strength, intelligence, whatever, there's just going to be disparities. That doesn't equal discrimination. So It sounds like the heart of your concern is
But just, you heard what he said, disparities doesn't equal discrimination. But when you turn it around, discrimination equals disparities. You've got to look at the other way. You got to look at both sides of that, right? Because when you see discrimination equals disparities, then you begin to see why, when disparities show up at alarming rates, it's important to investigate whether discrimination is present or not.
We can't just jump to fighting injustice unless we agree on a biblical understanding of what justice is first. So the church should be acting and carrying this out, but also critiquing ideas coming from the culture, or at least not passively accepting them, that might have inaccurate views of justice. Is that a fair way of capturing where you are?
Or more specifically, of injustice.
Of injustice. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Now, you talk about in the book, and you don't mince.
I want to get into this biblical justice thing, but they don't go into it. So I will.
To words in terms of, you think this evangelical catastrophe is coming, and that different views of social justice are going to divide churches, universities, schools, families, etc. Have recent events brought to surface the disunity that was already there? Or do you think these new ideas of social justice are causing that kind of fracturing and looming catastrophe that's coming in the future? Or is it both?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's definitely both. Listen, man, our adversary, the devil, is wise. I mean, he's sharp. And so, yeah, he does. He plays on weaknesses that are there, and also introduces things that will play on weaknesses that are there. And so I think it's both. And I think a lot of this, and it's kind of the reason that I wrote the book, a lot of this has to do with the fact that we're not speaking the same language, right? And so one person says social justice, and they mean one thing, and another person says it and they mean another thing, and all of a sudden we're having a disagreement on this. And you look at different events.
But Voddie, the only people saying, everybody who's talking social justice is talking about experiences. It's the academic community. It's the naysayer of it's the opponent of social justice who's coming in and taking the social justice word and saying, you don't mean what you're saying. Here's what that words mean. Therefore, I'm going to apply this meaning to what you're saying, even though that's not what you're saying. We know the people who are talking about social justice know what they mean. They mean the violation of rights, and I've gone through it. they don't mean this academic definition that you are applying to it because you went to a dictionary or you went to some academic hallway. They're looking at justice applied in the social sector, therefore social justice. You are looking at social justice in the way that Marxism applied socialism as a way to manage resources. And so when Marx says social justice, he does mean redistribution of resources. But when we say, I want justice in society, hence social justice, I want fairness and equality and equity and equality and equitable experiences and opportunities in society. Yeah, that's what that we want justice in the social space, right? That's where we want it. Hence social justice. If I could say it differently, little s, little j, social justice is social is an adjective, not a part of the proper noun. Capital S, capital J, social justice is probably what you're thinking about, which is tied over here to some economic systems and Marxism conversation. Now, most people aren't capital S, capital J. So, but you are the one that's coming in with this muddying up of what social justice means by bringing in this academic definition that that's not what they're talking about.
And people look at an event like let's say a police shooting or something like that, and one person is saying, here's the injustice again, and another person is saying, wait, don't we need to wait for the fact?
Okay. Did you hear what he said? Here's the injustice. Great. What's the resources that needs to be distributed here? There's none. The justice that's being decried is the experience.
Facts of the case, right? And then the person who says we need to wait for the facts of the case is accused of being insensitive.
Yeah, the person who's the subject matter at question is, was this an unjust experience that led to an outcome that we don't want? And if there's a series of those, then now you have a disparate outcomes and they show up on the chart. But what you're describing, Voddie, is the argument about an experience, not about where resources go.
Because the injustice is the disparity, regardless of the facts of the case, if you look at it from the CRT perspective.
No, the injustice is the experience. And the experience leads to a disparity. The disparity is the signal. The subject is the experience. The subject is the experience. The disparity is the thing that says, hey, something unjust happened here. Maybe. Right? The issue is what people are experiencing, what opportunities they have or don't have. It's the experience itself.
Perspective, right? And so I think part of it is we have not done the work of defining terms. And then I think the other thing is that there are many who have imbibed this sort of neo-Marxist critical theory, oppressor-oppressed, view, and may not have even, been able to put a name on it or know what it is. But they've absolutely bought into it, which makes this stuff sound more attractive.
Yeah. So you notice how we went from a police officer mistreating a black person and the story of that experience to Marxism, and socialism, which is an economic resource-driven solution. And you see there's a disconnect between neo-Marxism and how it distributes resources and the experience of injustice that's being talked about. And it's this is this language, this disconnect, that is what's creating the confusion and having people talk back beyond each other.
So, I mean, kindergarten through 12th grade, we spend 14,000 instructional hours in school, and we're being inundated with this neo-Marxist worldview. So,
come on, Voddie, 14,000 hours of instructional instruction is not being devoted to critical race theory and neo-Marxism. Certainly not. It's not even new. Nobody even knew what critical race theory was until 2 years ago when it came up. The problem that everybody is having is that critical race theory is not, or not critical race theory, that the story of race in America has not been told. It's certainly not being inundated. That's just that same fear-mongering kind of conversation. And I think that statement is beneath the intelligence of Voddie.
So it makes sense that especially the younger generations think like this already.
No.
So there's obviously a debate within the church, within the academia, about whether CRT is a worldview or whether it's just a tool. And I've read some debate on both sides of this. But what I found interesting is in your book, to criticize CRT, you quoted some atheists, which means clearly you're okay with people with a different worldview making a point that you're okay with. But when it comes to critical race theory, it seems like you wouldn't do that. So I guess the question is, why can we quote atheists but not use CRT as a tool?
But
good
there's
question,
a categorical error there.
Okay.
An atheist is an individual. CRT is an ideology. So I can quote an atheist individual, no problem, but I'm not going to use atheism as an analytical tool because atheism's wrong. Now, if someone who, is a CRT devotee says something that's right and true in another area, amen, hallelujah, praise the Lord. That's right and true. So what people are doing is they're making this categorical error. That's I've heard this from people like kind of a gotcha, you can quote James Lindsay and James Lindsay is an atheist, but then you don't want to use CRT. Again, on the one hand, you have an individual who's saying something that's true and right. On the other hand, you have an ideology that is inherently in opposition to biblical truth.
Okay, so to me, that is, and we'll end here, but to me, that is nonsensical. Whether it's a person or an ideology, whether the person declares, if a person declares 10 things and 6 of those things are true, those 6 things are true. If an ideology declares 10 things and 6 of those things are true, 6 of those things are still true. The ideology came from the person anyway, or a series of persons. So to try to distinguish between the individual and the ideology as it pertains to whether you can discount something wholesale or take pieces that are true and discard the rest is certainly intellectual maneuvering. Let's take, for instance, the theory, critical race theory is a theory. Critical race theory, let's take the theory of evolution. The theory of it, for many Christians, for many Bible-believing Christians who are early creationists, they would say that the theory of evolution is completely anti-biblical, as you said at the end of your quote there. That there's not, that whole theory and everything about the theory is anti-biblical. Therefore, based on the rules of Voddie Baucham, we should completely discount all truths that have come from the studies within evolutionary theory. That means that whatever science presents us from the theory of evolution and the analysis and the study therein, we should completely throw out, because it's not Charles Darwin that we disagree with. It's the theory of evolution that we disagree with, which is fully, quote unquote, anti-biblical. So therefore, whatever medicines have been found and crafted as a result of evolutionary theory, we need to disregard those as untrue and something other than what they are. We need to disregard the understanding of how our hearts and our eyes and our ears and everything that works in our anatomy, how those things work, because a lot of those things were learned about through the process of evolutionary study and the principles that came in and through evolution. What about all those animals that we learn about and we got the histories on? Maybe we shouldn't think about those, or the plants that we live in and the ones that we can identify as poisonous and not. All of these truths that come out of this evolutionary theory, we should throw those completely out, because the theory itself is, quote unquote, anti-biblical. And if it's anti-biblical, then nothing in it can be used to analyze anything. And if that's the way we're dealing with things, Voddie, then that means we look at the Bible and only the Bible for all things that are true, including why the antelope jumps. And of course, the Bible doesn't tell us why the antelope jumps or why the snake slithers, except to say that God made it that way. But we certainly don't get to understand how legs work or how muscles work together, or where the heartbeat shows up. None of those things, or how the eye is crafted, how the formula for glasses and how to deal with telescope. Like none of those things sit in the Bible, because He's given us His mind to put together things. And in the process, we learn things, and then we make mistakes, and then we fix those mistakes, but we don't write things off wholesale. And if you can grab a person who you don't agree with about everything, but agree with about some of it, there's no reason why you can't grab a theory and grab the stuff you agree with and not hold on to the rest. Love to hear you guys' comments at the end of all of this. Go ahead and leave them. Again, try to be nice, try to be respectful. Don't be afraid to disagree. We want to come back and chat again. Man, I think we're almost done. I think we maybe have one or two more videos to do in this particular interview. I hope you're enjoying it, and what we are working through together with it. Yeah, I think that's it. My name is Antoine Malone. I love you, and God does too. I hope to see you next time.